Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. I greet you on this, the 26th day of the month of Zulqa'adah from Sheffield in Britain with Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And this video is meant for my students around the world. I don't know how many there are. I don't know where you are. But they are always asking me, Sheikh, what book are you reading now? What book are you reading? Sheikh, I want to read all the books that you've been reading so that I can get the knowledge that you're getting. So I want to share with you that whenever I get a little time and I'm not traveling or I'm not lecturing, my favorite passion is to read books. And when I read books, I'm transported to other worlds. Let me share with you some of the books that I've been reading, and all of these books are now going to go to my son Mujahid, so he will read them. Here is a book by Moulana Abul Kalam Azad, and it's entitled India Wins Freedom. This book was first published as an abridged version. There were some portions of the book that he did not want to be made public for 20 years after he died. And those portions of the book that he kept for 20 years after his death was not published pertain in particular to his comments on his friend Jawaharlal Nehru, who became Prime Minister of Britain, of India. I read this book by Moulana Abul Kalam Azad, a man for whom I always had great respect. He made some mistakes in life, but when I meet with him, he will surely differ with me about what I consider to have been mistakes that he made. But nevertheless, I have great respect for him, and it was a very important book for me to read by Kalam Azad, because it's almost a biography. He dictated, and someone else wrote the book. And he kept out everything about his personal life. Nothing in there. It's only his political views here and some of his religious views. And he did make some very telling comments about Jawaharlal Nehru, which made me realize. It made me realize what I did not know before, that if in 1946 to 1947, the All India National Congress, the Indian National Congress, was led by Gandhi or by Azad, Moulana Abul Kalam Azad, partition probably would not have taken place. The British had come forward with a plan that made sense. And the Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah had accepted that plan. And Gandhi or Azad would have accepted that plan. It was because Nehru was a secular nationalist, and that secular nationalism clouded his capacity to think properly, because there is no absolute truth in secular nationalism. They follow whatever truth they perceive to be truth. But truth is from Allah. Truth is eternal. Truth is absolute. And both Gandhi and Kalam Azad were people who were religious in much. Nehru was not a man of religion. And that is why the 1 million lives were lost, because of that one, sorry to use this term, that one vain man called Jawaharlal Nehru. This is an important book to read, and I've just read it, and I'm grateful and thankful for having read it. Then there is a book on Nehru himself, written by an American scholar, a biography of Nehru by Stanley Wolpott. It's a huge book, and it took me some time to read this book. And having read this book, I realized that Abul Kalam Azad was correct, and that Gandhi was correct, that Nehru was in fact the one who was responsible, more than anyone else, for the partition of India and the birth of Pakistan. Had it not been for Nehru, it was still possible. The British had come forward with a plan which made sense, that the two people would have agreed to live side by side and to share India in mutual respect and in peace. So this is an important book that I read, and my son Mujahid must now read this book, A Biography of Nehru by Stanley Wolpott. He also wrote a biography of Muhammad Ali Jinnah that I also want to read. I have to order it. This is a book by Yasmin Khan, The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, which I have not read as yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I think Yasmin is here in Britain somewhere, so maybe after I've read the book, I'll try to meet with her. And here is a book by Nehru himself that he wrote when he was in prison, The Discovery of India. Not because he was a secular nationalist does that mean that I condemn him. There's much to be learned from him and much of benefit in studying the life and the works of Jawaharlal Nehru. My negative comments pertain to the disaster that took place when partition took place and 1 million innocent lives were lost, and that could have been avoided. So I'm looking forward to reading Jawaharlal Nehru's book, The Discovery of India. I've not read it as yet. Here are some other books. One of my students wrote to me and urged me to study the subject of the Caesarean, I don't know how you pronounce it, Muslims from the Caucasus Mountains. And their leader was Imam Shamil. And I then ordered two books. One was by Leo Tolstoy, the very famous, one of the most famous of all Russian authors. And he wrote this small novel, this book called Haji Murad, who was a deputy to Imam Shamil. And it was a very important book for me to read, to learn the history of the relations between Russia and Dagestan, the struggle of the Dagestani people for freedom and for an independent state, and the leadership of Imam Shamil and Haji Murad. I am very, very happy to have read this book by Leo Tolstoy. It's the first book I read by Leo Tolstoy. I hope I can read some other books as well. Inshallah. My son Mujahid will now read this book. And then I bought this book on the biography of Imam Shamil himself by Leslie Blanche, and she wrote a magnificent book. Oh yes. I spent 6 days in London finishing this book. It's a big book on the life of Imam Shamil, who led the Dagestani people 100 years ago or more in his struggle against Russia for freedom. What was plain and clear to me from my study of this subject is that they were following the Dagestani people and their leadership. They were following culture more than they were following the Qur'an. And that their knowledge of the Qur'an was defective. Yes, that does not mean that they were not good people, and a people in whom we can be proud in their courage with which they fought. But it was a hopeless cause, and eventually they lost. And Imam Shamil had to surrender to Russia. And he was then taken to Moscow, where the Tsar himself showed him that Christians had more of rahmah than Muslims. Rahmah, mercy and kindness. And he was amazed to see the qualities of mercy and of kindness amongst the Christian Russians. that he and his people did not have in Dagestan. So this was an extremely important book for me to read, The Sabers of Paradise by Leslie Blanch. I would like to read some other books of hers. This is a book somebody gave me, perhaps in Rotterdam. I won't mention his name, but it's a book on law, on international law. And what is the English title of the book? The Dayton Peace Agreement, Short-Term Redemption or Long-Term Tragedy, a study concerning the invalidity of an international treaty. I have been reading of this book. I have not completed it as yet. The author himself gave it to me while I was traveling. He, of course, is insistent that there was a genocide in Srebrenica. And I have said I don't consider it to be a genocide. I consider it to be a massacre, but not a genocide, because every single Serbian Christian I have met have denounced what happened in Srebrenica. So that cannot be a genocide. This is a book when I was in The Hague. A Moroccan student of mine invited me to come and have dinner at his home. He was Moroccan, his wife was Moroccan. And he urged me to read this book on sex and culture. And it's a huge book, and it is written by Unwin, J.D. Unwin, University of Oxford and University of Cambridge, Sex and Culture. I have not read it as yet. And finally, I just discovered this book on my own teacher by Dr. Omer Mahmoud Siddiqui. Omer was a young man when I was the principal of the Alimia Institute of Islamic Studies between 1986 and 88. And we decided that we'd have to institute a preparatory class, 1 year study, before we can decide whether you can be admitted to the institute. So I taught Omer while he was in the preparatory class as a very young man. And now, mashallah, he's a PhD, and he's a lecturer in a university, and a graduate from the Alimia Institute. And he has put together in this book the writings of several people who have written on Moulana Fazlur Rahman Ansari, including some of my own writings that I had forgotten about. And I'm just reading now what I wrote so many years ago, and I had forgotten about it, and what others have written. The title is Dr. Fazlur Rahman Ansari, the Ghazali of his age. It's a very interesting book, and I advise you to try to get a copy and read this book, what others have written about Moulana Fazlur Rahman Ansari. All of these books that I've read and I'm reading will all go on to my son Mujahid, so he can read them and be transported to other worlds of knowledge, which I hope will excite him. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.